One thing we want to remind you of is to constantly be in prayer for our church. And you also need to remember to keep your tithes and offerings up. Some of us do and some of us have not before, when we had to shut down before. But right now we're planning on this being very, very short-lived. But continue to remember to share in your offerings. You can mail them to our treasurer and they'll all be taken there. Our message this morning was we continue our study through 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verses 1 through 7, three pictures of a Christian life. And I want you to read along with me. You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, and trust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. Join with me in suffering like a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in the civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. Similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. The hard-working farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all this. Over the years, Christian people, and I think particularly Christians in America, began defining a commitment to Christ as a commitment to the church. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know, get up on Sunday morning, we go to Sunday school and church, then we head back on Sunday night, then we'd be there on Wednesday night, always be there at special gatherings, and that's commitment. Now, don't get me wrong. We need to take part in everything that we can that the church is doing. And I believe that. But I can remember one time when I was a kid that my mother noticed something that we'd see in the parking lot and the stores. We'd be going out to shop on Saturday or maybe Friday night, and sometimes we'd notice a car and there'd be a Bible up on the back seat of the car, and my mom would say, well, I guess they just have the Bible there so they won't forget it on Sunday. You know, it's hard for us to relate to that kind of thing today because churches today don't have nearly as many services as we did at one time. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's how it is. And of course today most of us have a cell phone that you have an application of a Bible app on it. And so, you know, it's with you at all time. But we can still have a very superficial relationship with Jesus Christ, and it sometimes can happen without us even realizing that we're falling into the trap. I sometimes refer to it as churchianity because I've fallen into that trap many times myself. And I think if many people are honest about it, then many would say they've done the exact same thing. Now, you know, we've been talking a lot about biblical Christianity of late. And in 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul tells us three pictures from everyday life that remind us and tells us what we have to do as Christians. And I want you to remember this very basic thought about being a Christian, that commitment to Jesus Christ requires giving Him everything. It requires giving everything we have to Him. Now, I believe Paul was specifically talking to Timothy, who was a young minister, and he was telling him that he'll grow if he cultivates this gift he's given. He says, you'll grow, and I want you to be strong in the faith. But if you remember, in one of the other sermons I've had, I said that these letters, while they were written directly to Timothy, they were read to the church. And so I think what he's saying here is, yes, this is you, but it applies to everybody. So I want you to think about these three pictures. And look at that very first picture. The first picture, he says, you're the good soldier. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 3 and 4 say, join me in suffering like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. What does the good soldier do? What does he do? The good soldier endures hardship. You know, the good soldier is going to be a soldier of Christ, at least. It belongs to Christ, and he's engaged in spiritual warfare. He doesn't shrink back. He endures hardship. Folks, I've never been in the military, and that's probably something I wish I'd have done. But you know, I hear of people that have been, especially in World War II or in Vietnam, and the things that they had to endure, Korea, all those people, what they endured, living out in the heat, living in the cold, doing all these things, enduring the hardship because of their job. So the soldier will endure hardship, but he's also going to be one who carries out his task wholeheartedly. You see, Paul is telling Timothy, I want you to give everything you've got to your duties. You've got to be wholehearted. There's no halfway in this. You've got to give everything you've got. Now, if you think about it, regardless of what he might think, the soldier's job is to do what his commanding officer says. Even if he thinks the commanding officer is crazy, even if he thinks the commanding officer is wrong, what the soldier is supposed to do? To do what the officer says. There's a reason for that. And Timothy, or any other minister, knows that that demand means we give everything to Christ. One of the songs I had picked out for our communion hymn this morning is an old hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And think about the words. One of the verses say, were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. When you think about what Jesus did, when I survey the wondrous cost of what Jesus did, that demands that I give everything, my soul, my life, my all. Back up in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul told Timothy that he wants him to be strong. And I see he's talking about a power to continue in what he's doing. Now in the military, like I said, I've never been in the military, and I regret that. I'm fascinated, though, by military history. And in the military, you do what you're told to do. Even if you're just in the reserves, you're in the National Guard, if you get called up, you have to go. You know, my own family has experienced that several times in the war in the Middle East. My son-in-law got sent over to the Middle East several different times. So he had to leave his regular job, go across over to Iraq, and then he came back after his job was finished. When I was working for the Anderson News, I was the sports editor, but sometimes I would venture out and do other things, especially we had major sections and they needed more stores, more copy. And I can remember a section we did on veterans one year, that I was fortunate enough to talk with some World War II veterans, and I asked them what they remembered from December 7th, 1941. If you remember, that's the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And I specifically remember one fellow who's now deceased, but I remember this fella telling me how he would see long lines in the next few days. He'd see long lines in the enlistment office of people just wanting to give up everything they had to go and join the Army or the Navy. You know, the good soldier isn't preoccupied with anything else except what he has to do. I mean, obviously, if he's in the battlefield, he's going to be thinking only about that because his main thing is to get out of there alive. But in verse 4, he says he's not entangled in the civilian affairs. I'm not sure of the picture Paul is talking about. But when I think of the entanglement, there's several different things I think about. One is from the military. The military people, especially in the Army, they would oftentimes put barbed wire around their bases. And the reason for that would be to keep the enemy from having an uninhibited way to get into them. And that barbed wire would entangle them and slow them down and may even stop them enough for them to be killed. But you see that Paul says to Timothy, you don't want to be entangled in these civilian affairs. You don't want to be entangled with something else. The bottom line is that they want you to put everything else aside and take care of your duty to Jesus Christ, number one. And folks, when I think about it, I don't know of a better picture of what a Christian life is than that of a good soldier. He's someone that's committed to the cause and he's determined to do what the commanding officer says. So the first picture is to be a good soldier for Jesus Christ. Well, the second one, Paul talks about the athlete. He talks about the athlete. If you go on into 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5, he says, similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. As I was preparing this message, and as I was at a football game Friday night, I was thinking about some things that were often said to me when I was working as a sports editor. And one thing that would come up occasionally, I mean it didn't happen all the time, but one thing that people would occasionally ask me, they'd say, why do you spend your time on such trivial matters? And at first I didn't know how to answer that, but finally I just said, have you ever read the New Testament? Because Paul, the Apostle Paul, used the sports of the day as illustrations of the Christian life several times. And there's great lessons to be learned from the world of sports. You remember a couple of weeks ago we referred to the emphasis that the first century people put on sports. You know, they all knew about the Olympics. Well, back in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, 1 Timothy 4:8, we read, for physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. The word Paul used for physical training is the same word from which we get the Greek, or we get our word gymnasium. And Paul was talking to people who were very in tune with the sports of their day. They knew about it. They knew what was going on there. Now, you think our world today is focused on sports? I made my living in it. And I was talking to somebody at a football game Friday night, and I said, you know, by the time I left, I was probably working 65, 70 hours a week. Sometimes it seemed like an 8-day-a-week job. Because there was so much to do, and people had that much interest in it. But sometimes I also believe that interest and that obsession got to be to an unhealthy level. So I'll talk about that. And as you see this, it'll be on Sunday. So you do realize that on Sunday afternoon, I'm talking about this unhealthy obsession. So what will I probably be doing? Watching football. My wife is over there shaking her head or nodding her head that that's what I'll be doing. So what are those characteristics of a successful athlete? He competes by the rules. That seems to be so basic. But he competes by the rules. It's not just the rules applying to his races or his events, but also to his training. If you keep up with sports news at all, you've heard of many different athletes who've lost great awards because they've been caught cheating. I always think it's funny that every year when they run the Boston Marathon, or one of the great marathons in our nation, you'll have a story about somebody who tried to cut short, maybe cut a few miles off the 26-mile trip, and somebody will catch them, obviously. It's always that way. Well, it was the same way back in the first century. One scholar that I read said that there's evidence that athletes had to state an oath that they had fulfilled 10 months of training before they were allowed to enter the race. Now you'd say, why would they do that? Because who would care if they want to finish last or whatever? Well, folks, there was a standard here. They didn't want to lower the standard of what the games were. They were to be special. And there were to be severe penalties if someone broke those rules. I think what Paul's saying here when he's talking about the Christian life is that you have to have self-discipline in all things. And I think Paul is telling Timothy to live by those rules that are fixed through the following Jesus Christ and the teaching of Jesus Christ. I believe that we have to have a wholehearted devotion to Jesus Christ. You know, when I talk about following Christ and following the rules, I hesitate at times to use that term, rules must be followed, because the Christian life is much more than just following a set of rules. It's not I do this, and do this, and I don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do this. Christian life is a lifestyle. It's everything we do. But still, there are expectations. The expectations that if you are giving your life to Christ, you do not participate in sin. That's what Paul said to the church at Rome. In Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, he said, "What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer?" If you become a Christian, you put an old life behind you. The passage that Stephanie read for our communion meditation, Ephesians chapter 5, illustrates marriage by the relationship of Christ to His church. And he also illustrates the relationship of Christ and His church by marriage. They illustrate each other. They showed this beautiful picture. Now, in case you didn't know it, I love my wife dearly. And I sure don't know what I would do without Stephanie. I truly believe she's a gift of God. And that means I try to please her in everything. I fall short at times, but I really try to please her. I do draw the line when it comes to college sports. She's a Cardinal, and I'm a Wildcat. So I do figure there's a couple of days of the year where I'm always right. Ha 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 ha. She's shaking her head like I'm crazy. But, you know, we have a good time with that. But seriously, she's a huge, huge blessing to me. And I do things for her because I want to, not because I have to. It's because I want to. She does things for me, not because I demand that she do it. She does things for me because she wants to. Now, I know I hurt her at times, but I would never purposely hurt her. And it's not because there's a book of rights and wrongs in our marriage, but it's because our relationship is on such a deep level. And that's the picture that Christ gives us with the church. So how does that relate to athletes? Athletes rarely want to let each other down. Even competitors
who want to compete will do so, wanting to do so at the highest level, and they have little use for those who break the rules. You know, my favorite sport of all is baseball. We're talking about the athletes. I love baseball. Baseball is my favorite sport. And I think it's ironic that two of the most iconic records in the game are held by people who are not in baseball's Hall of Fame. Home runs. Barry Bonds hit 762 home runs in his Major League Baseball career. That's 7 more than Hank Aaron, who set the record when I was a kid. And it's 48 more home runs than Babe Ruth, who's usually considered the greatest home run hitter of all. Barry Bonds became eligible for the Hall of Fame in 2013, but he hasn't made that yet. By contrast, Babe Ruth and Hank Aaron both made it their first year of eligibility. It's not because Barry Bonds' accomplishments aren't worthy, but there was a controversy about him using illegal drugs or performance-enhancing drugs, which are illegal in baseball. As a writer in the San Jose Mercury News recently wrote, his ballot problem is just so different from most other players who have to convince the voters they were good enough to be Hall-worthy. He has to convince them his use of performance-enhancing drugs is not disqualifying. So the traditional final ballot push may not be as applicable. And then in our area, everybody here knows the story of Pete Rose. I remember the night when Pete Rose got hit number 4,192 to pass Ty Cobb as the man with the most hits for anyone. He finished with 4,256 hits, and he was on the winning side of 1,972 games, more than any player in history. He was on teams that won 4 World Series, yet he's not in the Hall of Fame. And why? Because he broke the rules about betting on baseball games and received a lifetime ban. You may agree or disagree with what's happened in either case. I'm not going to debate that here. But the bottom line is, somebody said there was rules that were broken. And 2 of the greatest athletic accomplishments ever are not recognized because of that. The good athlete keeps the rules. As a Christian, we keep the rules of Christ. And that leads us to our last thing, the farmer. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 6 says, the hard-working farmer should be the first to receive a share of crops. Most of us here at East Union have been around farm life and know the amount of work that comes with it. When I was a kid, we didn't have fall break. My Thanksgiving break was usually on Friday. We were stripping tobacco, and then we were back in the tobacco barn on Saturday stripping. Spring break might have been a couple of days for the teachers to go to KEA meetings, but when I was old enough to drive the tractor, that meant my spring break was plowing for our cornfield. Putting up hay in the summer. We didn't quit at 5 or 6 o'clock. You kept going until it was in the barn. I can remember many nights eating supper at 10 or 11 o'clock because we kept going until we got all that hay in. And that was with machinery. I've set many acres on a tobacco setter that was on a tractor's 3-point hitch. But my father had one of these old hand setters. He used to show me how you used them. I can't imagine going through a tobacco patch with one plant at a time. I can't imagine cleaning a large amount of land with just a hook sickle. I can't imagine plowing with a team of horses or oxen. But the farmer is hard working. And I believe that what Paul is saying is if Timothy or any other worker exerts himself to the full performance of God-given tasks, he will be rewarded. His faith is going to be strengthened. His hope is built up. His love is deepened. His gift is enlivened. All these things happen if you give everything you've got to Jesus Christ, and other people will see you and be blessed as well. The idea for us is to be hard-working Christians. Many of us were brought up on the idea that Hard work is one of the basics of our society. You work hard in school, opens many doors. Many people have had different doors open because of different gifts. In my time as a writer, I don't know how many times I saw young people have opportunities to present themselves simply because they work hard. And as Christians, in God's kingdom, we have the responsibility to work. And sharing the gospel is not easy. If we're Christians, we need to remember that Christianity is a lifestyle. It's not an event for spectators. It's about getting out and doing what's necessary to win people to Christ. You know, everybody has different gifts, so we go about it differently. I talk to different preachers who have different ideas and different gifts about what they do well than I do. I have different gifts what I do well than they do. Every person, though, is different, and we approach every person differently. But the whole idea comes back to the text. We are to be hardworking like the farmer. I grew up on a farm. Now, we didn't have a lot of crops. We had more cattle than anything. But we raised just enough crops to feed the cows and to have the corn and the hay for them. But what if I planted that corn in April and didn't harvest in the fall? What if we applied fertilizer to the hay fields and then didn't cut it? For that matter, what would happen? We didn't even spread the fertilizer or line. Folks, we had show cattle. I remember one year at a show, one of our best animals was a little heifer, just a few months old, but she was really good. And I remember the first time we took her in the ring, she was not happy. She balked, she kicked at the judge, and folks, that wasn't all that uncommon. That happened often when you had an animal going out and doing something for the very first time. But a friend of mine who was there said, he kind of joked, he said, "Did you break her last night?" And I laughed about it, but she eventually did fine, and she won the blue ribbon just about every time we took her out. But it was work. It was hours and hours of work, feeding, grooming, working, trying to get that animal to calmly lead. And folks, it was rewarding. As a Christian, we need to be hardworking, and that's what we as the church must have. Here at East Union, we've got an enormous task before us. It's not always about just feeling good. It's not always taking in a blessing. It might be giving back that blessing. It's going out and making a difference in the world around us in Nicholas County, and Bath County, Montgomery County, and Bourbon County. We live in a world that desperately needs Christians. It desperately needs us to roll up our sleeves and battle Satan. Folks, I think it's interesting as I close to think about what Paul said. He said, reflect, think it over in verse 7. Digest this, because being a Christian is more than coming and sitting in a pew. Don't get me wrong, I love seeing you every Sunday. And in 2020, things have been difficult for us. But it's a struggle I've never experienced. We need to make sure we don't fall into the trap of becoming spectators now or anytime. It's easy to become spectators, looking for something to make us feel good, make us think we're doing great. But Paul gave 3 pictures. He says, there's a man whose desire is to please his commanding officer. And in our case, it's pleasing God. Putting those affairs above all. There's the athlete who competes by the rules, and the farmer who toils for a great, great crop. Today you have a decision to make. We're not at the church building, but you can make that decision wherever you are. My guess is most of them who are watching today are Christians already. All of us need to examine ourselves to see if we're really living as the soldier, as the athlete, and as the farmer. If you're already a Christian, I pray that you get motivated to do things for Him. to be only for Him, to live by the rules, and be hardworking. If you're not a Christian, don't put that decision off to accept Christ and be baptized. You know, we're doing a virtual service today, but just drop me a message and we'll work things out about getting together, because I'm available to talk with you. Finally, I placed a video in the comments section of the Facebook, East Union Facebook page. It's a great song that captures everything that we've said today. So I want you to be sure, if you don't listen to any of the links, listen to this one. Listen to Ricky Skaggs and Kentucky Thunder sing Soldier of the Cross. And I've also kept the lyrics, put a link to those lyrics there too, in a separate link so you can do both together.